marks the 30th anniversary of the infamous 1985 draft. It put frozen envelopes into the sports vernacular, and to this day, fans believe the NBA rigged the draft to give New York the #1 pick, which of course was Patrick Ewing. You wrote about it for the magazine this week, and you said you believe the conspiracy goes back to before even the draft happened. Why were general managers like Stan Kasten of the Hawks expecting New York to get the top pick?
You know, it's interesting now. We sort of think of the 80s as the heyday of the NBA. You think of Nike and Jordan and Magic and Bird. But when the draft lottery was imposed in 1984, the league was in real trouble. They were losing money from the majority of their franchises. Their TV deal was coming up. Stern told me that he'd actually paid USA Network $40,000 to broadcast the draft, and the draft was being broadcast on a weekday in the afternoon on the USA Network. So they really needed a boost. And the thinking by some going into that draft was that, well, you know, if Ewing lands in Sacramento or Golden State, which at the time was also sort of a relevant franchise, that doesn't help the league. But if Ewing lands in New York, obviously this is a pillar franchise, even more than. And Ewing, it's hard to think about it now, but he was perhaps the most recognizable athlete ever to come into pro sports, which is what SI said at the time. So that combination was a huge potential cash cow for the league.
Yeah, he went to 3 NCAA tournament finals and won one. You mentioned the $40,000 that the league paid USA Network. It's a bargain considering how much that moment of David Stern pulling the envelopes out of that big plastic ball has been viewed. If the NBA truly wanted to fix the draft, Chris, why would they do it in front of a live television audience?
That's why I always thought it was pretty funny. You know, before this, the draft was decided, the first pick was decided between the two worst teams with a coin flip. And, you know, maybe there's a photographer in the room or maybe a couple team representatives. But if you wanted to fix something, you know, that'd probably be the way to do it, you know, on a conference call. So in this regard, the first time they've televised it, and not only that, this was at halftime on CBS of a Celtics-Sixers game, so it was a pretty big audience. And, you know, not only that, but Stern's gone to all this trouble to do it himself and be up there. I think there's a lot to be said for if you're going to try to fix something, you would have started televising the draft the next year.
It's just so interesting because you got a chance to speak with David Stern about all these conspiracy theories. What was your biggest takeaway from the former commissioner from your conversations with him?
I mean, David Stern's very savvy. I say it up front. You know, you sort of have to prepare for David. He's very smart. And in my conversation with him, we spoke for almost an hour, and he's almost mellow about it, which I didn't expect because some of his prior responses have not been exactly mellow, more peevish. He's been very defensive about this over the years, but I think he is starting to realize that now that he's retired, this is probably not the worst thing for the league. People create a mythology around it. It stirs up interest. It creates villains and heroes. That's exactly what a league like the NBA thrives on. So even though he didn't like being accused of this over the years, whether or not he did it, I think he's now starting to realize, well, let's not worry about that too much.
Yeah, it created villains. It created him as a villain. So, Chris, after all of this reporting and all of your work, do you think the 1985 draft was fixed?
I don't think so, but I love to hold out hope that it might have been. It's one of those things you can't definitively prove one way or the other. You know, I heard some convincing arguments. People around the league saying, you know, 3 out of 10 people think it happened. The plausibility of it relying on the fact the league was so desperate back then, and that it was sort of an ad hoc thing. There wasn't a huge office. There wasn't all this media covering everything. You know, the league was worried about going bankrupt, essentially. Not overall as a league, but their teams going bankrupt. So, you know, maybe you tweak something here or there. I think it's plausible. I don't think it happened, but it's fun to think it was plausible.